you so much for that. We'll see if this is on. Yes. Financial crisis. So you cannot see that in the will to give.
I think you do see that financial crisis in some areas. We, every year, launch an appeal for the countries that are at the top of our agenda in terms of the need for financial support. And how we see that support is very variable. So there are some appeals for countries, for example, like North Korea, which I visited very recently, where there are some 6 million people who are in need of food aid, where the appeal is only 37% funded, as one example, as opposed to the Horn of Africa, where after a very slow start, but where after visits by myself, the Minister Carlsson, visited as well, and other ministers from many countries, we really raised the profile of what was happening in the Horn of Africa, and we saw a huge outpouring of support. We're all very conscious that the global financial crisis has the potential to have a major impact on our work. And this is why issues around value for money and efficiency are so important. But the moral imperative is also important. And this is something that I think a lot of people are very conscious of. So people talk a lot about donor fatigue. They talk a lot about the fatigue of people who support us. I think there is an element of fatigue, but I think it's actually much less than we sometimes think it is. I think the onus is on us to make the case as to why our work continues to be important.
Thank you. We will continue to discuss this further on. Sweden's Minister for International Development Cooperation, Gunilla Carlsson, please.
Thank you, Nathalie, and thank you all for coming here today, Excellencies, dear friends, but also Baroness Amos, dear Valerie. It is very good to have you here with us today, because it's very important that we can make visible the hard work that is done every day by people in the humanitarian system to show how we are working, and that we can have a sustained and good response for people in need, that we can have you here for almost 2 full days, or where you're meeting not only here at the Institute, but also with the parliamentarians. You are meeting with our humanitarian network. You are meeting with many of us that are working every day with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on trying to be good donors and good partners with you. So we thank you so much for coming here and to spending your time with us, so that we can elaborate upon what's done so far and what needs to be done. And I'm proud that Sweden is one of the main actors within OCHA. And we have been that for a long time. In March 2006, just a couple of months before I was appointed Minister for Development Cooperation, a meeting took place here in Stockholm. The 4 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, met with the United Nations country team for Somalia to review the worsening humanitarian crisis in that country. And the southern and central parts of the country were affected by a severe drought. Millions of people in the Horn of Africa were suffering, and tens of thousands were dying. Tragically, the situation in the Horn of Africa in 2006 is very similar to the situation here today that you mentioned. And still we do meet Nordic ministers to deal about these things. It is painfully clear when you read the notes from the meeting that I mentioned. However, this crisis that we now are witnessing is even worse. In 2006, more than 2 million people in Somalia were affected by the crisis. This year, the number is 4 million, as mentioned, or 50% of the Somali population. The challenges to peace, security, and development in the Horn of Africa remain wide-ranging and acute. And now, when the TV cameras have left, I'm really happy to see so many of you here today, because you know that the crisis is not yet over. We still see that there are enormous camps built up. We see that there is lack of security. There is a lot of demands now for health care, both physically and mentally, and that people need to go back home to do farming, and still a lot of problems to tackle. I visited the Horn of Africa twice since the crisis escalated this summer. One observation is that we tend to equate the Horn of Africa with Somalia. And why is it this? Let us not forget that the drought itself had affected all the countries of the Horn. However, Kenya and Ethiopia were better prepared, and the drought did not escalate into a large-scale famine. Nevertheless, both of these countries host a large number of refugees from both Somalia, and they require assistance. Eritrea has only recently asked for help from outside to map the consequences of the drought. In Somalia, the drought has led to famine, and the most fertile areas are the hardest hit. This is due to long-term conflict, lack of security and infrastructure, and all above, lack of political will and capacity. In Somalia, I met with desperate mothers in camps for internally displaced people. I saw malnourished children who may not be alive today. What I saw made me even more determined. We must do all we can to break the vicious circle of recurring humanitarian crises in the region. And when I was there, out in the fields, I also saw the chain. I saw the chain all the way from Sweden, where people do want to assist. I saw the big UN agencies working together with local NGOs in order to distribute our help, to see that it was done in a dignified and professional way to really deliver to those in need. And I think we need to tell about this, that food, shelter, water, medicine is distributed in a very good way, and the whole chain is functioning. And we need the chain. And even though that Somalia is one of the most dangerous places in the world, it is extremely difficult to work in, we have seen that the humanitarian assistance is getting through to the people. This is thanks to admirable work being done by the humanitarian workers. Scaling up the delivery of humanitarian assistance in Somalia has lifted 3 regions out of famine. Even though the humanitarian needs are still enormous, the humanitarian assistance is effective. Another and a third observation is that financial contributions are not enough. Recent major humanitarian catastrophes, such as in Haiti and Pakistan, have shown that coordination of humanitarian assistance is crucial in order to use funds as effectively as possible. Avoiding fatal gaps and harmful duplication in the response allows us to deliver the assistance more effectively. By jointly assessing the situation and needs, agreeing on common principles and priorities, and developing common strategies, more lives are saved. This is why Sweden is OCHA's not only second largest donor, we are also the country that are working with coordination, because we know that the Office of Coordinating Humanitarian Assistance saves lives, thanks to that we coordinate and that we use the system. So, dear Baroness Amos, Valerie, we are so happy that you and your staff are here with us today, because your efforts and your success are impressive. We will continue to work together to make the world's humanitarian actors understand the value of better planning and coordination of humanitarian assistance. And we will do that jointly, not only with Nordic colleagues or with old donors, but also with the new donors coming there, willing to work together, finding out how we can do this in a very effective and good and even broader way than we see today. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in order to break the vicious circle of drought and famine and suffering, we have to turn to politics. Looking beyond the immediate humanitarian response, a sad conclusion is that drought in the region occurs with increasing frequency. But as the experiences of Ethiopia and Kenya have shown, drought does not need to be equated with famine. We cannot shy away from the fact that famine is almost invariably the end results of flawed policies. Conflicts, soaring food prices, and inadequate food resilience priorities have severely worsened the effects of droughts. Therefore, at the same time as we try to save lives, we must continue to find ways to prevent a repetition of this enormous suffering. Efforts to achieve stability and peace are imperative. In achieving lasting and positive change, we need to understand the demographic shift in the countries of the Horn and its socio-economic consequences. Rapid urbanization and increasingly young population and no jobs is a very lethal mix. We also need to address the effects of climate change on livelihoods. Early recovery and the building of resilient communities are at the center of these efforts, and we must step up our commitments in this regard. Economic and political solutions are needed, and here the international community can and will play a crucial role. But the biggest responsibility lies with the affected countries themselves. African leadership, both national and regional, is now key to finding long-term solutions. The people in the Horn of Africa will never escape the effects of droughts as long as their leaders run away from their responsibilities. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in January, the UN team for Somalia will again visit Stockholm. And once again, we are discussing humanitarian crisis in the Horn of Africa, affecting millions of people, just as we did regarding Ethiopia in the 90s, Ethiopia in the 80s, Somalia in the 90s, and Somalia once again a few years ago. This makes me both angry and determined, because I know that crises like the ones the people in the Horn of Africa are now experiencing do not have to happen. Peace, stability, and food security can be the reality even for people of Somalia. Obviously, this will take time and a great deal of hard work. But prevention of similar crises in the future is within reach if all parties are determined and get their acts together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to invite our panelists as well. We have Eva von Oelreich, who is the president of the Red Cross Sweden. Please have a seat over there. And also Pia Prytz Phiri, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. She's a regional representative. Please have a seat. So, if I understand you all correctly, money is really not the problem. What would you say? There is money. It's on.
Yes, it's on. Yes, there is money, and from Sweden's point of view, increased amount of money, but it's not enough, and that's why it was good to talk to Valerie this morning about strengthen efforts and coordination and how we are dealing with the money. But I think it's about politics, as I said, and that's why I wanted to mention that today, because I think people will get even more angry than I if we continuously go back to them and to say that we have problems here with humanitarian catastrophes that could have been avoided. So we have to deal with the root causes. And there is more political will needed and not only money.
What are the root causes, would you say?
Well, as I said, flawed politics. I mean, it's lack of security, obviously. It's lack of an inclusive growth. It's lack of growth, you could say. But I think there is opportunities for Somalia, even though there is a growing population and a lot of tensions on the soil. I still see that with the right policies, things can work out. Of course, also with Kenya, we see that if there is political fragility, that will, of course, also hamper the opportunities to take on that you have so many refugees in your own country. So it's very, very important to have politics right. And that's, of course, a mixture. But that's why we fight so hard for human rights and democracy, because I think that's the only way also to make people included and to be able to be resilient themselves, because the external shocks in this world, climate change, more frequent droughts and floods, will mean that societies and communities need also to be resilient themselves in order to help each other. And again, That's really something that we should be very humble about. The capacity of locals to help locals. Sometimes that's also forgotten when we talk about who is bearing the burden. Yes, Swedish taxpayers is doing enormous. We have a lot of fantastic humanitarian workers, but do not forget about the locals there that are helping sisters and brothers.
Valerie, yes, I was going to ask you, if you were to pinpoint the main reasons for famine.
Well, can I just go back to one thing that Minister Carlsson said that I would really like to support, which is this point about, I don't know if you would call it a failure of politics, but the reality of a political context when you're looking at a situation like the Horn of Africa. Because I absolutely agree with all the points that the Minister made, but there's something else as well that I think we don't think enough about, which is that in these really difficult, complex political environments, there's both a global political context and a domestic political context. And of course, the domestic, in my sense, in something like Somalia or the Horn of Africa, includes the regional. And the interests are not all the same. So what happens is that there's an element of shared interest in that we all talk about the importance of peace and security, but how you get to peace and security is differently understood. And it's differently understood, of course, because we have different interests in the way that we achieve that. So as someone who works within the UN family, for example, and where you have 193 member states of the United Nations, all of whom have a place and a say, countries exercise their power in that context in very different ways. You have the power of the Security Council, you have the power of the G77, and in a situation like Somalia, where we know that this is very much a divided country, where the transitional government, which is receiving a degree of international support to try to stabilize the country in geographical terms, and if you see what happened in the last couple of days with Al-Shabaab once again destabilizing Mogadishu, where they do not even control the capital city, and where you have some countries supporting Al-Shabaab, you have some countries wanting to deliver that peace and security in a different way, where Al-Shabaab is a terrorist organization, a prescribed terrorist organization in some other countries. You can see the kind of complexity that we're talking about. And a political solution is essential for our humanitarian work. But at the same time, whilst they are working to get to that political solution, we get caught up as humanitarian workers in these different political debates and discussions, which has implications for where we go, who we can reach, and how we're seen. And a very good example of that is that after the Kenyan incursion into Somalia, Al-Shabaab banned 16 organizations, including a number of UN organizations, from operating in their territory. And making that case and saying to our partners who are seeking to come to this political solution that in the way that you do that, please do it in a way that does not impinge on our humanitarian operations, that enables us to really get to the people who continue to need aid, is not always an easy sell.
So number one is bad leadership and realpolitik.
Weak leadership and realpolitik, yes. And I think that we can only succeed seriously in bridging this divide between humanitarian and development, and really using our humanitarian interventions as a bridge, a support into longer-term development efforts, if you have the right kind of leadership in the countries in which we are working, where you have a leadership that prioritizes issues around some of these social security type issues, if you like, and focusing on education, on agricultural development, on livelihoods development, as opposed to putting money perhaps much more into defense and security, as one example.
Pia, from your perspective, if you take the microphone very close to your mouth, your comment on this.
Well, I think if we look at the humanitarian work that's been done, I think, first of all, I think it's important to say that UNHCR has a very special mandate when it comes to the refugees. And when we talk about the Horn and Somalia, we play a very modest role in Somalia itself in terms of heading the protection cluster and the emergency relief cluster. But outside, of course, we are dealing with the fastest growing refugee situation, the one in Kenya. And that has a lot of challenges, including very recently when staff has been abducted and where our security within Kenya and access to the camps has been hampered, and where the primary aim has been to request support from the Kenyan government to allow us to even get to the people we need to provide help to. So there is no doubt that we are working in an increasingly volatile environment where security for both the refugees and those of us that are trying to help is becoming a challenge. It is also very clear, and I want to say, of course, I mean, there can be, we can continue with humanitarian assistance, but if we don't find political solutions, and they need to start, and I also fully subscribe to the thinking around the importance of quite early on looking at the bridge to development, to consolidation, and to go beyond the situation of conflict as a way out of it. In terms of coordination, which was discussed before, I think, I mean, from UNHCR's side, we have been fully engaged over the last 5 to 6 years with the work of the cluster approach, and what I think maybe is not so visible is just to what extent the various operational agencies are trying to align its way of working with the OCHA standards and within that umbrella. We have strengthened our capacity to lead in the protection side by hiring a lot more protection officers. We're working very hard on training staff in leadership. Leadership is the core to coordination. Leadership at the central level, but even more regional leadership, you know, at the local level. The better leadership you have, whether it's within the overall humanitarian coordination or whether it's within the clusters, the better we will succeed in exactly reaching and deliver to those that needs our services. I just want to give an example of how much we are trying to align ourselves. Just on Monday this week, I went to Sandö, where MSB is having a training school where we were training emergency information managers, and present there were OCHA, UNICEF, WFP, and we're trying to set up as a first step a joint emergency information management system and strategy that will help us to provide the planning and to have a joint strategy.
You didn't do that before?
I think we have always done it, but the fact that we are now doing it with the overall orientation, I mean, we've always, as an operational agency, worked with other operational agencies on the ground, but the sort of emphasis of doing this also with OCHA and having OCHA with us and using OCHA standards and aligning ourselves with this entire process, I think is something that has gotten a lot more impetus, and something that you feel as a staff working for UNHCR. I'm 27 years with UNHCR, and I've certainly seen a major change in the whole way of thinking over the last 5-6 years, and not only that, but also trying to strengthen the various agencies that are working within this coordination.
Eva, from the Red Cross, your comments on what you heard? It's on.
It's on.
Yes, but it's close to your mouth.
Okay. Well, I think a lot has been said already. Humanitarian action doesn't solve political problems. Political solutions are needed in Somalia, but humanitarian action has its place. And even if the crisis is for the moment changing a little bit now that rainfall has started in Somalia, we know that the harvest will cover only a third of the needs in food, and we know that there are immense needs also during a long time ahead. I think it's important to look at humanitarian action as helping people survive in any case, and not only survive, but also go back to having a possibility in livelihoods, to go into those long-term areas that Valerie Amos was talking very much about, and I totally agree that we cannot see the borders of humanitarian actions only in response. We need to understand the underlying vulnerabilities, which are so atrocious in Somalia. I'm so glad that Gunilla Carlsson says she's angry, because I was in Somalia early 1992, and I thought it was the most desperate situation I had seen. The UN ships were lying on the waters outside and were shot at and couldn't get in with World Food Programme's food, and the only organization in the country at that point was the International Committee of the Red Cross. There were refugee camps, makeshift, without water, without latrines, and it was absolutely hopeless for a month or so. Of course, it stabilized slowly, but we can think now of these people who've been there all those 20 years and have been totally worn out by continued insecurity, continued droughts and floods and lack of food. This is wearing a people down in a way I don't think we can ever imagine. So when we're now there, we also know that the security situation hampers a lot of possibilities. Now lately, when 15 organizations were asked to leave 3 provinces, including some UN organizations, we were happy to see that the International Committee of the Red Cross could still be allowed to work there. And I think one of the reasons was that ICRC has been there for 30 years and has been perceived in this situation as one organization who can stay. I think in that sense one can also look at it from a coordination point of view. We need to be complementary. When one goes out, the others do more. In this case, it's also Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, who can continue to work in those areas. But we never know. We may, in the next moment, be unable to do the work we can. In this case, with ICRC, we are pleased to have the Somali Red Crescent on the ground. I saw 8 clinics when I worked in Somalia in 1992. Now there are 72 health clinics, and they are essential. You talked about local capacity, and we need to recognize the growth of not only the Somali Red Crescent, but also other local organizations in Somalia who are doing the brunt of the work.
Thank you.
I should give one example, which is not conflict related. The Kenya Red Cross has grown enormously, and it is interesting to see when local capacity becomes a real force in the country. By launching a campaign, Kenya for Kenyans, they have collected funds for not only Dadaab, but for Turkana, for many parts of Kenya. And I don't know the figures now, but they're astronomical. It's great to understand that a country like Kenya is starting to sort of move and help people in their own context. Do you want me to say something about coordination now, or later?
Sooner. Later. Sooner or later. Valerie.
I wanted to say 2 quick things, if I may. One is that ICRC, as Minister Carlsson said, we had famine in 6 areas of Somalia. It's now 3, and one of the reasons for that is that ICRC really stepped up to the plate and are now feeding 1.1 million people in the Al-Shabaab-held areas. And I think we all really have to recognise the role that you've played in relation to that. But I wanted to come back to the specific question you'd asked me about drought and how do we deal with it. I was in Ethiopia about 4 months ago and met with a group of pastoralists who said, we used to experience the kind of severe drought that we're seeing now every 10 years, and now it's every 2.
Yeah.
So the reality of what we talk about in terms of environmental degradation and the impact of climate change is very, very real. And to get to this community, I I was on a plane for 2 hours, and then I was in a 4x4 for an hour and a half, being bumped across what were not roads, but basically sand. So the scale of the investment required to build the resilience of communities and countries is significant. And I think we have to recognize that. We have to recognize that as donors, and we have to recognize as countries. Because if we're going to make a reality of the preparedness agenda, then we have to have a real mind shift in terms of our thinking on investment. And yes, it's made a difference in Ethiopia and in Kenya, the preparedness work that has been done, but it's not nearly enough. Looking at, rainwater harvesting programs, and all of this is important. But the kind of large-scale investment that we're looking for, we need to include the World Bank, the regional development banks, the Islamic development banks, and we need to have a much more strategic regional approach to these issues.
Security Council.
We need to recognize the security implications. We need to recognize that you have to have a private sector engagement with all of this. But the private sector is not necessarily going to engage in countries with a conflict dimension unless they can see the returns that they're going to get on their investment.
Some criticism one hears often is, that aid organizations are actually destroying the local infrastructure and entrepreneurship, for example.
I don't want to answer every question.
No, but this one, it's for you.
I think there is a real, issue for us, and I think this goes to the heart of some of our thinking about what kind of humanitarian or development system do we have, and is it an inclusive system where we recognise that there are new actors, a system where we recognise that there are different cultures and different ways of doing things, and we try to adapt and become more flexible, or do we stay as a system which says this is what we have and you have to buy into our rules to join? I think we have to adapt and be more flexible, and if we do that, then we help to build a greater local capacity. We as UN agencies and our partners are really only able to operate in Somalia because of our local Somali workers. We're only able to work in parts of Sudan because it's Sudanese who are doing so that cooperation, that recognition that it isn't about necessarily bringing in international workers, that yes, you want a mix, but that principally a lot of that work is being done locally, I think is absolutely critical in terms of that investment. The work that the World Food Programme have done in terms of, more local purchasing, more cash for money, cash for work schemes that help to rebuild local economies is absolutely critical.
It's a new view, sort of.
So there's a mind shift happening, and we just need to see more of it.
The international community is very aware of the crisis we are currently going through, but it prefers to treat the symptoms rather than the cause. This was recently said by Raila Odinga, Kenya's Prime Minister.
Yes, and he and the government that he is serving have a lot to live up to. It's a very good quote, and thank you for mentioning this, because I think we also have to understand that, as said, there are no humanitarian solutions, there are humanitarian response, but we need political solutions in order to build resilience. And when I traveled to Mogadishu, and of course there you can see the fights and everything that Valerie so elegantly talked about the high politics that's there, that is a lot of conflicts, but going then from Mogadishu to Turkana in north of Kenya, and to see that I was probably one of the few ministers ever set my foot there, because Kenyan ministers do not go there. Malnourished children, yes. Women have about 7 children per woman. Investments there are nil. You really can't see that the Kenyan government are living up to what Raila Odinga is saying, and he is a modern Kenyan politician. Yeah. But I think there has been no investments. They have not prepared the Turkana people to be more resilient. And there are things you can change, but that means you have to do investments in resilience, but also in functioning societies that can take part in globalization, in growth, to have inclusive growth that could be sustainable and that you also can learn to live together if you should keep people there. And this is also so tragic to see, because we see the immediate emergencies, but we don't see the continued emergency situation, and we don't hold governments accountable to that. And we are running in there and continuing to feed the problem.
Who should do that? Who should?
We should. We should ask.
We, the Swedish government?
Yes, absolutely, because that's when I'm going now to look at the situation. I go to Nairobi and hold talks, and when I go to the Gaza Strip, I go to the Israelis and to say that we are not going to sustain with humanitarian assistance here, because why should we? Why should Swedish taxpayers? Because it's about politics. You have to solve the political problems, and they are immense in the Horn of Africa, I agree. But everyone now has to start to try to find solutions. And there are political processes going on, absolutely. But I mean, if we just continue to be good humanitarian donors, we might prolong the problem or the situation. So it's really to balance these. And I think as humanitarian organizations should do their job. But me as a responsible politician must deal with the root causes. And that's many times, as I said, flawed politics. And we have to address
What does flawed politics
that means
mean?
politics that are not working. I mean, when you see that you are not living up to what you should do in order to see that you are serving your people. And there we have to be more, I think, outspoken. And specifically we who are doing a lot of humanitarian assistance, because we are doing it not to be blind and just kind, but we would like to see a change. And that change must be political.
Eva? You had some comment before, you said.
Oh yes, that was before.
You forgot about it.
No, but I was. You asked a question around if we're part of the problem, the humanitarian sector, and I wanted to mention because we talked about humanitarian coordination before. I was, with another hat on, very much involved in the humanitarian reform and in the clusters and so on. And I think.
What hat was that?
Sorry.
What hat?
What hat? I was the head of the steering committee for humanitarian response, and I was sitting on the interagency standing committee that is one of your, which is the coordination group for humanitarian response in the world, and I think that some of the experiences in building up that system was also that the whole sector becomes more knowledgeable. I think the next problem is that you need to include also the Turks that are in Somalia, the Islamic groupings, because we are not yet fully inclusive. That's a big issue, and I think there are many more. But
we didn't talk about the Chinese. Otherwise, in all my panels, or with the Chinese in Africa,
the Chinese in Africa, they're not involved in humanitarian aid. They're more
they're
involved
political.
in building infrastructure and in the political
Is that
parts
good?
of it. Well. It's not for me to answer that question as
What do you think?
The president of the Red Cross.
I'll say something about it if you like.
It's a political part.
But you want to finish off your...
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in the humanitarian coordination is absolutely crucial. And I think that one of the problems within the community is that humanitarian is seen as a subtitle to political, which means that for coordination, OCHA has to have the lead. Sweden and some other states are trying to reinforce that understanding within the UN, and I think that needs to be taken on by more countries. If one understands what humanitarian does in the vacuum where there are no political responses, I think one can also understand the role of OCHA more clearly. Leadership, accountability, results. You push them, they also need to come as results.
We will soon open up also the floor for some questions, but Chinese.
Just on China, there are always questions around the nature of China's investment on the African continent, and is there sufficient attention paid to some of the issues around governance and corruption? I think that we very often ask those questions to the wrong people, because there's a whole long history of investment on the African continent, not just from China, but elsewhere, my own country, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. I think the question is more rightly asked of the leadership of those African countries in terms of when you are doing your investment deals, be they with China or anybody else, what is it that you're looking for in terms of the longer term development of your country? So what are you asking those investors to ensure is put back in terms of building capacity, be it institutional or people, in terms of the legacy that will be left for your country once those investors withdraw? What is the long-term benefit for you? And that's where I think the question is rightly put.
And because in the other part of Africa, they did miracles. Angola, for example.
There are all kinds of examples of good and bad investments and the difference that it has made. And I think that some of what we've seen with initiatives like the Extractive Industries Initiative, for example, the issues around publish what you pay so that people in a country can see the investment dollars going into that country, and then they can ask their government, well, how has that money been spent and how has it benefited us? I think the power that we give to citizens is the crucial dimension or element here.
Well, I'd just like to maybe go a little bit back and talk to the issue of it's not only financial assistance, but it's also political support to a process. And I spent time in Kenya. I was there from 93 to 1997 to 2000. And when you mentioned Turkana, Turkana is hosting another refugee camp, and you have the Dadaab. And I remember when I was there, and we were talking within the UNDAF process, which is the planning process of UN agencies, of the importance of trying to bring development to those areas. It was quite clear, and I think it is quite clear, that we're still working very much under the we need to negotiate with governments where it is their priorities are, and we need to do things where the governments find priorities are. And often that is not in refugee-impacted area or in the most, poor areas of the countries. And Kenya, from the Horn, is one example of that. Now, I think when we talk about going from humanitarian to development, or we are talking about preparedness, it's not only the financial contribution that is needed, but it is also a pressure from governments that are also bilaterally engaging with countries to make the case that development is something that covers the entire territory of a country and not just, parts, and must be based on where the needs are the greatest. That's the way that we will bring the capacity to deal with famine and other disasters that may come for the population wherever they live in a country. So I feel very strongly about that. It's been a long battle, actually, for UNHCR to even attract the attention of fellow UN agencies then to do more in the refugee-impacted areas, precisely because they said, we can't do this. We're doing what the government feels that we can negotiate, we can do. And I hope that we're turning a page. And I know for a fact, when I was in Bangladesh latest from just a couple of years back, I spent 3.5 years there, that the tremendous political support we got for the UN agencies' efforts to get into refugee-impacted area were immense, and Sweden should be commended there. But we had actually 14 ambassadors who sat with us on a monthly basis, who agreed on a core script that would be used as negotiations and interactions with our government interlocutors, and that would be repeated by visiting ambassadors or ministers and so on and so forth. It was very forceful. Now, it didn't succeed, I must say, because we had a problem with politics eventually. But I think, nevertheless, that it's a good example of where it matters, that it's not only the money we bring in, it's also the political impetus.
Yeah, we should open up the floor.